Hey guys, so in this video, we're going to be talking about how to write a synthesis essay. So first of all, what is a synthesis? According to Purdue OWL, a synthesis is when you look for areas where your sources agree or disagree, and you try to draw broader conclusions about your topic based on what your sources say. Writing a research paper usually requires synthesizing the available sources in order to provide new insight or a different perspective into your particular topic, as opposed to simply restating what each individual source says about your research topic. So that's a mouthful. To make it simpler for you, writing a synthesis is basically looking at the conversation that's happening among a variety of sources in order to support the point that you're making. So a synthesis isn't just restating what an author said or what multiple authors said, and it's also not comparing and contrasting two different sources or three different sources. What you're doing in a synthesis is you're thinking about the argument that you're making, and then you find multiple sources to support the argument, and you kind of show the relationships between those sources. So what are the goals of a synthesis? First is to show connections between your sources, and you use your sources to support the argument you're making. So again, you're not simply restating that someone said this, you're using that source to support whatever claim it is that you're making. So some tips to keep in mind when you're writing a synthesis. First, you want to take a lot of notes on your articles, especially when you are writing about, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 articles. It will be very difficult to keep track of everything that everyone is saying and to remember everything that everyone is saying. So as you're reading, take lots of notes. If you have connections that you can make between sources, take notes on that because that will come in super handy when you're ready to actually write your essay. Next, you want to discuss multiple sources in each body paragraph. So remember, when you're writing a synthesis, you're showing the connections between sources. And you can't effectively do that if you are dedicating one paragraph to one author and then another paragraph to another author. We're not really seeing those relationships. So you want to show those relationships in as many body paragraphs as you can. And that relates to my next point, which is to focus your paragraphs on the point you're making that supports your thesis rather than individual articles. So when you're writing your paper, you want to think about what points you're making that support your thesis statement. So if you are saying that physician-assisted suicide should be legalized in all 50 states because we want to give patients autonomy and the ability to make end-of-life decisions for themselves, you want to think about 2 or 3 articles that are supporting that particular point and discuss those different articles within that paragraph rather than just dedicating a paragraph to each author. Next, you're going to develop an in-depth understanding and familiarity with your sources, so you're not simply choosing quotes from each source. You're explaining the relationships between your sources. So you can't simply quote multiple things in your paragraph. You want to show those connections throughout to help support your argument. Next, the topic sentences for each body paragraph should be specific enough to clarify the point you're making, but also broad enough to incorporate the articles you're discussing in the paragraph. So with this point, you want to think about broader connections that you can make between articles so that you can incorporate multiple articles within that paragraph. Because if you're too specific and you're focusing on a point that only one article made, then it'll make it very difficult for you to create those connections. Next, don't create false connections or forced connections between your sources. If they don't connect, then they don't connect. It's worse if you try to force a connection because then the reader will be left very confused. So you can either find another source that connects to the article, or you can only discuss one article within that body paragraph while still ensuring that you are synthesizing the majority of your paper throughout. If there are contradictions between your sources, do your best to explain those contradictions rather than ignoring them. So just because two sources are disagreeing doesn't mean that you have to ignore it. There has to be a reason why they have differing perspectives on that point. So try your best to explain those different perspectives and why that difference exists. And finally, attribute credit to your sources throughout. It can get very confusing if you don't. So I cannot emphasize this enough. I have read so many synthesis essays where I'm not really sure who is being quoted. And when you have an essay that has, 6 or 8 sources, it can get very confusing to keep track of everything. So please, every time you quote, you want to give credit to that source and tell us where it's coming from. So now we're going to look at how you should structure your synthesis essay. And when we're done, I'm going to show you guys a sample body paragraph. For your introduction, you should always start with an attention getter. And this is something that grabs the reader's attention and makes them want to read your essay. It builds interest in what you're writing about. So an attention getter can come in the form of a question, a shocking statistic, an anecdote, an interesting quote, etc. After your attention getter, you want to provide background information. So you want to think, what does your reader need to know to fully understand your topic? If you are talking about, let's say, physician-assisted suicide, your reader might not have any clue about that topic. So you might want to give some background information talking about what it is, why the debate exists, like why there's a controversy about it, why some people, why it's legalized in some states and why it's not legalized in others, etc. So just a brief background so that your reader will be able to follow the arguments that you're making in your paper. Next, you're going to state your thesis. So the point of you writing this essay is to present an argument. You want to make that very clear in the last 1 or 2 sentences of your introduction. If you have a longer paper, like a 20-page paper, then you can get away with doing a 3-sentence thesis. But most of the time, you'll keep your thesis to 1 or 2 sentences. So now let's get into the body paragraphs. Everything that I just went over for the introduction is pretty typical across the board when you're writing essays. But we're going to now look at body paragraphs for synthesis essays, which might be a little bit different from what you're accustomed to writing. So we're going to start with our topic sentence. Every essay, every body paragraph needs a topic sentence. And a topic sentence just tells us the main point of that paragraph. But it should, for a synthesis essay, your topic sentence should be general enough to incorporate both sources. So for example, if one of your articles is looking at participants' socioeconomic status through the lens of race, and then another article is looking at participants' socioeconomic status through the lens of the caste system, then what you want to do is, instead of specifying race in your topic sentence, you can talk about socioeconomic status in general in your topic sentence, so that within that paragraph you can talk about race and caste, and therefore be able to discuss more than one articles in that paragraph. So if you only talk about race in your topic sentence, then your discussion will be very limited because you can only reference the article that discuss race. But if you broaden it and talk about socioeconomic status, then you can discuss multiple articles there. So after your topic sentence, you want to give a little bit of an introduction to the point that you're making so that your audience can follow along with the argument. The question to ask yourself is, what does your audience need to know in order to understand your point or the evidence that you're making? And you want to give some context there. Next, you are going to provide your evidence from one article, and this can come in the form of quotes, statistics, paraphrase, summary, examples, and you always want to introduce your evidence with a signal phrase, which we will be discussing a little bit later when we talk about APA formatting. Then you're going to transition to your second source and provide your evidence. And you then want to analyze your evidence. So what is your evidence showing? How are the sources connected? And then finally, discuss your point. So how does this paragraph support your thesis statement? And this is something that a lot of students miss when they're writing their body paragraphs. I have a lot of students who will give a quote and then they analyze the quote, but they don't actually tell me how it's supporting the overall argument that they're making in their essay. So analysis is basically thinking about how your quotes are supporting the point you're making in your topic sentence, whereas discussion is thinking about how this entire paragraph is supporting the overall point that you're making in your essay. And then you're going to transition, so you will connect your body paragraph to the next body paragraph. So usually your body paragraph will follow this structure. Sometimes you might intertwine the evidence from both of your articles and then analyze that evidence and then discuss your point. Sometimes you might separate it, as I did in this outline. Sometimes you might have evidence from your first article and then you analyze it, and then you provide evidence from your second article, and then you analyze that, and then you discuss your point. So you can kind of see what works for you and what works for that paragraph. But in general, we want to have these different elements in a body paragraph for a synthesis essay. So let's take a quick look at a sample paragraph for a synthesis essay. So the thesis for this essay is that Facebook is damaging romantic relationships since couples tend to become addicted to presenting an image of perfection rather than living authentically in their relationship. And now we'll start with our topic sentence. So it says, furthermore, increasing likes and comments can become the main priority in the relationship and may even lead to Facebook addiction. Now we provide some background information. Now this may sound bizarre. Facebook is not a drug, so how can one become addicted to it? In her analysis of Facebook's effect on the brain, and here we have our evidence, Ridfo noted that with 2 billion likes a day and 1 billion comments, Facebook stimulates the release of loads of dopamine as well as offering an effective cure to loneliness. Now here's a bit of analysis. Dopamine is known as the happy drug. When it is released, the person has pleasurable feelings. So receiving likes on Facebook has the same effect on the brain as eating chocolate, having sex, and using cocaine. It should be noted that dopamine alone does not cause addiction. And now we have our transition to our second source. However, the reward center in your brain releases dopamine in response to pleasurable experiences. This part of your brain is also closely linked to memory and motivation. So this is our second source. So here, as you guys can see, we're using multiple sources to support the point that's being made. And now I go on to show the connection between those two sources. And within this, I have analysis and I have discussion. So one might be motivated to continue engaging in behaviors because they're seeking out that pleasurable feeling. How does this all connect to relationships? When a person posts a picture with their significant other and they get hundreds of likes, they get a hit of dopamine. Later, they might try to recreate that experience because they feel the urge to seek out that pleasurable feeling. This urge may start growing into an addiction, and they start doing things in the relationship that would guarantee likes, such as spending money they do not have, or disregarding their partner's desire for privacy by posting intimate moments. In this way, the desire for likes takes precedence in the relationship, and this can be especially problematic if both partners do not share this desire. So if you take your time and analyze this paragraph, you'll notice that it has the various elements that were mentioned in the outline for the body paragraph. And in showing the relationships between those sources, it helps us to strengthen our argument because it's not just one source that agrees with this, it's multiple sources that agree with this point. And then within our conclusion, we always want to briefly summarize the main point that we're making in our essay, but we want to limit this to 1 or 2 sentences. Maybe you can push it to 3 sentences if you have a longer paper. We don't want the entire conclusion to be a summary of our main points because we just read this essay. So it's a little bit insulting to your reader if you are summarizing everything that they just read. Just think about the main ideas that you have mentioned and give a brief overview of those ideas in your conclusion. And here I have provided some suggestions of other things that you can do in your conclusion in addition to summarizing your paper. So you can show any personal connections or opinions that you may have. Throughout your essay, you should not have personal opinions or personal connections. You should save that for the conclusion, especially because this will be a research essay. The body of your paper should be focused on the articles that you're discussing rather than any personal reflections. You can also show any connections to your field of study. So if you are a psychology major, you can talk about why this topic is important to psychology, for example. If you have discussed a problem in your paper, then you can offer solutions to that problem. You can ask rhetorical questions, which are questions that do not require a response, but they're just there to help your reader think more deeply about your topic. And finally, you can show any connections to society at large. So why should we even be talking about this topic? What are the societal implications, etc.? And you don't have to do all of these things in your conclusion. That would be a very long conclusion. Just always summarize in 1 or 2 sentences and then think about what works best for your paper. So I hope with this video you have learned how to structure your synthesis essay and you've taken a couple of tips to help you succeed in this process. Writing a synthesis is going to be very challenging, especially if you have never done it before. So please be patient with yourself and be kind to yourself. And I want you guys to really think about the connections that you can make between your sources to help support that main idea or that main argument that you're making. That's what a synthesis really is. It's about showing those connections to support your main argument.